I'm Susan Blank,
I'm Lynn Wagner.
and we're licensed professional counselors in Atlanta, and we're the organizers of Duty to Warn Atlanta. And it's our pleasure to welcome you to our town hall. Thank you for your patronage and support. Duty to Warn is an association of over 800 mental health professionals advocating that Donald Trump be evaluated and, if deemed appropriate, removed under the 25th Amendment as he's psychologically unfit to serve as President of the United States. Slide 2.
Clinical psychologist John Gartner, thank you, PhD, is the main organizer of this movement, and he started it with a petition that he posted on change.org. This was several months ago. He sent this petition across nationwide to thousands of mental health professionals who signed it. And about that same time, Dr. Bandy Lee, who is a Yale psychiatry professor, she organized a meeting of concerned mental health professionals at Yale to discuss this issue. And at that time she stated, "We have a duty to warn against a leader who is dangerous to the health and security of our patients, our countrymen, and our world." We are advocating, actually, that Trump be removed from office via the 25th Amendment, if that is an avenue. So that's the way Duty to Warn was formed by Dr. Gartner. And as Susan said, it currently comprises about 800 mental health professionals who are sufficiently alarmed as we are and are speaking out.
Sure. Duty to Warn has a book, which we invite, we'll pass it around and invite you to look at. It's The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. It's the consensus view of 27 mental health experts that he's dangerously mentally ill. The book debuted on the New York Times bestseller list this Sunday, and it has sold out on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and it is now in its second printing. So we encourage you to look the book over, and you can get it on Kindle or in the hard copy.
It is nothing but signatures. It has approximately 63,000 signatures of mental health professionals nationwide, which, hang on, I'm going to talk about that. So the petition reads, can y'all hear me? I feel like I'm screaming. The petition reads, "We, the undersigned mental health professionals," thank you, "believe," are we on? Yes. "Believe in our professional judgment that Donald Trump manifests a serious mental illness that renders him psychologically incapable of competently discharging the duties of President of the United States, and we respectfully request he be removed from office according to Article 4 of the 25th Amendment of the Constitution, which states that the President will be replaced if he's unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office." As I said, this petition has about 63,000 signatures right now. It's 345 pages in length. And as soon as this meeting is over, this one is going to be delivered to Sonny Perdue, who is part of Trump's cabinet. We had also intended to send one to Tom Price, and we know what happened there.
On April 6th of 2017, a congressional bill that would establish a commission on presidential capacity was introduced in the House of Representatives to form a body of medical and psychiatric experts who can evaluate the president for removal from office under the 25th Amendment. This is H.R. 1987. The sponsor of the bill is Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland, and he is the keynote speaker at our Washington, D.C. event. Dr. Bandy Lee of Yale is consulting with Democratic members of Congress on setting up an expert panel to give advice on the president's mental health. They're looking at using the Army Field Manual as their guideline, and we hope that our petition adds impetus to the passage of this bill.
Recently, we have officially formed the 25th Amendment Political Action Committee, and the purpose is to organized grassroots and financial support for the people in Congress who support H.R. 1987. What we are doing is planning to do is use social media and broadcast and print media to expose Trump's unfitness for office. And the PAC will be urging voters to choose a candidate, any candidate, regardless of party, who will help remove him. This organization is nonpartisan, and again, we will support any person who supports the president's removal. We believe the 25th Amendment is a red meat issue, and it will motivate people to actually vote in 2018. We believe we are in a unique situation. I don't think I'm understating it to say it's becoming an emergency.
Okay, and we're extremely fortunate and grateful to have Dr. Seth Norrholm and Dr. Drew Westen of Emory University with us to speak about Mr. Trump, the issues he faces, and their views on this. And we ask that you hold questions until the end when we will have a panel discussion. And we also now have with us Dr. Roger Cooper, who will also speak on his views on Trump's mental illness. And thank all of you for your generous offer of time and expertise. It's most appreciated.
Thank you. It's my honor to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Seth Norrholm. Dr. Norrholm, PhD, is an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Emory School of Medicine. He is a full-time faculty member in the Emory Neuroscience Graduate Program, and he is a member of the Emory Clinical Psychology Graduate Program. He has spent 20 years studying trauma, stress, anxiety, depressive, and substance use-related disorders, and he has published over 85 peer-reviewed research articles and book chapters. His work has been featured on NBC, ABC, CNN, USA Today, WebMD, Politico Magazine, Huffington Post, and in Scientific American. We're very privileged to have him with us today to discuss the weaponization of fear, narcissism, and fitness for duty.
So I started this about 2 years ago now, and really it was in response to what we had been seeing and hearing in the media regarding the upcoming election. So this was back in 2015, and it was at that time when then candidate Trump started to make some of the inflammatory and misleading or false statements that he would make. And it really became clear to many of us in academia that he was trying to play not only the country, but he was trying to play everybody as fools, and somebody needed to speak up against this. And part of the problem is that, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, is that the mental health community really is handcuffed in a lot of ways in what it can say and how it can say it. And so platforms like these are very important to actually speak out and get the word out there. So I'll update this when I get home, apparently. So my talk had a few different titles. The one that I went with today is actually the same title as a Huffington Post article that I wrote with a collaborator of mine named David Reese, who is a psychiatrist who's based out of Boston, Massachusetts. And the title of our paper was The Eternal Emperor in His Own Mind. So this is our conceptualization of how Donald Trump sees himself, how he interacts with the world, and that'll be a focus of a lot of what I'm talking about today. So the distorted reality of Donald Trump. And it's this distorted reality that really is at the crux and at the center of why there's a lack of fitness there. So I invite you, if you have time, to peruse, and I'm not selling myself, it really just provides a really nice narrative. It's almost a play-by-play. So starting back in October of last year, within my Huffington Post column, it goes step by step to where we are today in terms of the lack of fitness and how that's changed. And you can also see in the bottom right-hand corner is my Twitter handle. I'm going to talk a lot about Twitter today because it is so central to this issue. So if you're not on Twitter or if you're not familiar with Twitter, I can walk you through it. You can ask me questions about it. But really, a lot of what we're talking about with the Trump presidency and its many different machinations and expressions is Twitter-based. And so I am on Twitter. I have a very strong presence on Twitter, and that's really a primary place where I've found a way to get the voice, our voices heard and out there. And this is just a special thanks to my co-worker and co-author David Reese, who is also an author of one of the chapters in the book that we talked about at the beginning of today. So a few opening remarks about the Goldwater Rule. I suppose you all in here have heard about the Goldwater Rule and you know about the history. So just briefly, we're talking about 50 years ago now. A survey was sent out to thousands of psychiatrists to weigh in on the fitness of Barry Goldwater as a candidate for president in 1968. And it became clear that this may not be an ethical stance for psychiatrists to take in terms of weighing in on a political candidate. And so the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, and many other associations instilled this Goldwater Rule, where unless you are seeing somebody in a clinical situation as a patient, you shouldn't speak out about their whatever their diagnosis might be, their symptoms. But what's unique about the situation now is you've got the Goldwater Rule on one hand, and you've got duty to warn on the other. Duty to warn refers to a Tarasoff case many years ago in which it became clear that if a mental health provider hears that a third party is at risk or in danger, then it is the mental health provider's responsibility to do something and say something about it. And so these two have been played out against each other. And so what I would say about that, and this is my personal stance on it, and I know it's shared by many, at least 63,000 by last count, is we're not diagnosing Donald Trump. We're not placing a label on him. What we are doing is looking at publicly available behavioral samples that everybody, you don't have to be a mental health provider, they're available to everybody via the popular media, television news, the 24/7 news cycle. You're seeing these snippets of behavior. So in a lot of ways, you're seeing more of the quote-unquote patient than you would in a 50-minute session if you were doing therapy with that person. So we're not making a diagnosis. The other thing I would say about diagnosis is really for billing purposes. It's for classification purposes. Insurance companies want to see a diagnosis. It makes no difference to me if we walk out of here saying, this person has this disorder. It doesn't matter. It's a classification. It's a nuance. What we're really talking about is a pattern of destructive and harmful behaviors that are on public display. And who is best to speak about those things than those individuals who see these things and experience these things in real life? So one of the examples that has been used is if you're watching a football game and you see a player get hit and his knee is bent askew at an unnatural angle. An orthopedic surgeon can see that play and say, he probably tore his ACL, his MCL, and probably has a displaced patellar tendon or something like that. He's making a diagnosis, but he hasn't seen the patient, hasn't laid hands on the leg of the person, but based on what he knows, based on his experience and his expertise, he is making a judgment based on what he is seeing. This person probably has a significant damage to his leg, and that could be a problem. So that's the approach that we're taking to that. And the other thing I wanted to say in my opening remarks is, I'm a fear researcher. I've been studying human fear for decades. And it became very clear at the beginning of the candidacy and now during the presidency of Donald Trump that fear plays a central role in the man himself. So I'll talk about narcissism in a second. At its core, there is a fear in the narcissist of being caught, of the jig being up, of the cover story being blown. And so a lot of the behaviors that a narcissist will engage in is to keep that cover up, to prevent ego injury, is a psychological term for it. And so there's a fear within the person of being caught, of being exposed, is another way to look at it. And that fear really comes from, as our civilization is developed, there's a fear of ostracism. So one of our colleagues, one of mine and Drew's colleagues at Emory, Philippe Rachat, talks about we live our lives through the gaze of other people. So what's unique to human beings is the ability to feel embarrassed, or the emotion of being embarrassed, publicly blushing in public, having a fear of public speaking. All this is grounded in this fear of being ostracized, of being alone. And so that's at the core of narcissistic fear of ego injury. The other thing I would say is fear is in the populace. So whether you're aware of it or not, there's a strategy of fear-mongering that is being played over and over and over within this president and in the days of his candidacy. Building a wall to keep out illegal immigrants, for example. If you look at the things that you should be afraid of as a human being, there's about a 1 in 138 million chance that you're going to be killed by an illegal immigrant, whereas there's a 1 in 7 chance that you're going to die of a heart attack. There's a 1 in 400 chance that you're going to be the victim of an assault of some kind. There's a 1 in 30 chance that you're going to fall and hit your head. So this idea of fear-mongering, of overplaying threats that are not really threats, is central to the platform of this president. And so that's where I really come into this as far as my approach to how to address this president. So Drew's going to talk about this. I've seen Drew talk before, so I don't want to take too much of what he's saying, but how did we get here and where do we go? So if you look at what this presidency is based on right now, in terms of that being the base, if you will, there's a base of supporters, which I have at the bottom there. There's that concept of fear that I talk about, underlying racism and sexism that are rampant within this president and the supporters. And you can't underscore enough the complicity of the GOP. We are in this position today, we're having this conference today, because there are mechanisms in place to stop this sort of thing that aren't being used. That's a fact. Russia and the influence of Russia, it's an ongoing investigation, but it's very clear that through social media and through the people that the president and the candidate Trump surrounded himself were highly tied to Russia, and lies, lies, lies. And so I talked a little bit about this. So we got to this place because 2 primary checkpoints were completely bulldozed through in terms of how this person became president. One is the primaries, so you just watched a bully through not very sophisticated name calling. Sticking an adjective in front of somebody's name is not really that clever, but that's a tactic that the president has used. The Electoral College, as outdated as it might be, and you can argue back and forth about whether or not we should have the Electoral College, but it was in place to keep demagogues from taking power, and it failed completely for a lot of reasons, one of which people didn't want to speak up, didn't want to speak out, didn't want to upset the apple cart. Now, what we do know is there are 2 things that are out there that may or may not have an effect, and I'd like to think that many of us hope that they do, is the ongoing Mueller investigation and the 25th Amendment. So as part of our grassroots movement, John Gartner and several of us that have been involved in this duty to warn movement, is we've been talking directly to Congress members. We've been talking to Adam Schiff. We've been talking to people who have influence. We're reaching out to Bob Corker because it seems like he's starting to lean in a direction that we need him to lean into. So we're having the conversations with people that may be able to make a difference, as it was said in the beginning, politically. And then you've got all of these compounding factors. If you're talking about the lack of fitness for this president, yeah, there's narcissism there, but there are so many other things there that can be addressed in terms of lack of fitness. The nepotism, the surrounding himself with his family, with Jared Kushner, with these individuals who are just making the issue much more dangerous for the American people. This idea of normalization, another word that we use in neuroscience terms is habituation. If you're bombarded with the same stimulus over and over, you're going to get used to it. And that's why, again, it's important to have events like this to remind ourselves, don't get used to it. This is not normal. Fight normalization. Normalization is when the president gets up and he reads off a teleprompter and the news media says he sounded presidential today. He did for 15 minutes. Don't normalize that behavior. Authoritarianism and a disregard for rule of law. So authoritarianism, in this case, he's doing a lot of things that are unpopular, that make our security less so in the world in global terms. But a lot of that authoritarianism is self-serving, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And let's not forget the fact that we're talking about somebody who is inexperienced, who has never been in this position, and who will not listen to advisors who have been in that position before. Ignorance, the man does not study, the man does not read. This is dangerous. So I want to talk about narcissism for just a minute in terms of the way that we view it. Now, this is a slide that I put together, and depending on who you talk to, there are many schools of thought with regard to narcissism. This is just one way of organizing it. If you think about narcissism on a continuum, so on the far left side, you have what we call benign, healthy narcissism. The fact of the matter is that we all live our lives from a first-person perspective. And so as children and as toddlers, we are the center of the world. And then through healthy psychological development, you learn, I'm not the only person in the world. Other people's feelings matter, other people's values matter, other people are important, it's not just all about me. What can happen is people can get stunted and stuck in that stage of development where they stay within that person-first perspective. And then as you move farther down the continuum to more dangerous degrees of narcissism, then you start to see destructive patterns emerge, impact on self and others and family members. So one of the things that I want you to keep in mind also is you think about our relationship with this president and our relationship, his relationship with the American people, is to think about it in terms of an abusive relationship, because many narcissists are in abusive relationships, whether it involves spouses or children or both. And so the narcissist dominates the household and conducts a number of behaviors which are dangerous to the spouse and the children. Imagine the American people and our foundations as being the spouse or the children. So keep that analogy in mind. And as you move farther along, you have sociopathy, or a lack of empathy. We see that a lot, and I'll point out some examples in a few minutes. As you move even farther, you've got psychopathy, which is not just a lack of empathy, but cruelty. And you've got sadism, which is deriving pleasure from other people being harmed. And I think you can make a very good case that we see these things within the sitting president. And so then at the bottom you see the degree of malignancy. So the worse you get as a narcissist, the more these really evil, dangerous factors come into play. So you've heard this term malignant narcissism thrown around. Malignant narcissism is not a diagnosis, it's a descriptive term. To describe the president as narcissistic, it's not making a diagnosis, it's making an observation about his behavior. And so just to run down quickly, malignant narcissism, and you can probably draw to mind examples of this if you think about it. Grandiose sense of self-importance, one of the cornerstone lines that you heard from the president as he moved along in the campaign was, I alone can fix it. Preoccupation with unlimited fantasies of success, power, and brilliance. Belief that one is special. Consistent requirement for excessive admiration. Sense of entitlement, taking advantage of others for personal gain. Vindictiveness, and I'll touch on that in a second. As I mentioned, lack of empathy and a hypersensitivity to criticism. So, anybody recognize this picture? It's kind of hard to see here.
Correspondence dinner, right?
So this is Donald Trump at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and at this particular moment, President Obama is making light and making sport of Donald Trump. And so if you were to boil it down in a nutshell, the repeal of DACA, the attacks on the ACA, anything that has Obama's name on it, as one person tweeted earlier this week, all of this because Obama called out Trump during the White House Correspondents' Dinner. It sounds silly to say, but a lot of the things that he's doing appear to be motivated by this vindictiveness, this vengeance against being slighted by the former president. So I mentioned protection from ego injury. This is at the core of narcissism. And the way to get around having your ego injured is to lie, is to create a false narrative, to create an alternative reality. And so at last count, we're up to 1,300 lies since he took office, and it's only October. Some of the biggest ones that came out early, the biggest electoral college win since Reagan, not true. Largest inaugural crowd in history, again, not true. Voter fraud cost him the popular vote. Obama wiretapping him, and I show you the wiretapping spelling that he used, just as an aside. Creation of an alternative reality in the face of conflicting evidence and a quasi-delusional state. I'll talk about what that means in my closing slides. Simply put, one cannot lead within our world if you're living within your own, and that is what I believe the current president is doing. The other thing that I want to point out that may not be clear is that the narcissist does not think in linear time. So does not think. So if you imagine your life as being riding on a train and you're going down the path and you are aware of where you are right now, you can look back at where you've been and you can look forward to where you're going. You've got what we call linear thinking. In the narcissist, that becomes distorted. That straight line becomes broken so that their reality actually exists in a bubble, a protective bubble, if you will, where the emotions and the life events are all in the present. They're all acted on as if they're in the present. They're all experienced as if they're in the present. And so that's why something that happened 2 years ago still has the same emotional impact with this president than it did at the time that it occurred, because it is still in the moment. So think about this person as acting and behaving as if everything is in the present moment. It's called the collapse of time. Gratification is sought within the moment. Praise is sought within the moment. Boastful statements are made even if there is conflicting evidence just minutes away or that has already been produced. It doesn't matter when you're living in the moment. So this magical immortality is embraced. So I mentioned Dr. Reese, who I work with a few minutes ago. He and I had a discussion over the summer, and I said, you know, Trump is a father, he's a grandfather, and does he not ever think about what his legacy might be? Does he not ever think that all these things that he's doing can have an impact on his kids and on his grandkids? And Dr. Reese and I really came to the conclusion that he doesn't, because he lives in the moment. There is no thought about legacy. There is no thought about consequences. There is no thought beyond what's happening right now. And in a lot of ways, if you're a severe narcissist, you have this fantasy that you're going to live forever because you don't think about the end of your existence because that's all you know. So the other thing that the extreme narcissist does is what's called impressionist thinking. So a psychologically healthy person will use facts, will use logic, will use evidence for and against acting a certain way. A severe narcissist bases everything on impressionist thinking, on emotion, on guts, on what they're feeling and not what they're thinking. And so what that produces is what's called the hypocrisy democracy. And I use that as a title for one of my articles. Because with everything that you can see, and it's sort of a running joke on Twitter, is for every tweet that the president makes now, you don't have to go very far back to see a tweet that totally contradicts what he just said. Because he's living in the moment, he's basing his tweets on his emotions, and he's not doing a side-by-side comparison of what he said previously. So some examples that come to mind. This was during the campaign where he said he would be the best president for the LGBTQ community, and he would do all these great things, and he grabbed the flag, and it was a great photo op. And then not too long later, this year we had the transgender ban in the military, completely contradicting what his platform had been earlier, because he's basing things on what's going on right now. And what's going on right now is there's an ongoing Mueller investigation, there's constant criticism, and so he needs to appeal to a source of what we call narcissistic fuel. He needs adulation, he needs adoration, he needs something. Where does he get that from? His passionate base. His passionate base doesn't want transgenders or gays in the military, so he's going to post something like this because it feels good in the moment. Another example is calling out the Democrats as being obstructionists, and they own Obamacare, and all the statements that he made about the Democrats back when he was trying to repeal the ACA. And then what happens, he has an Oval Office meeting with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. They say nice things to him. This feels good in the moment. Suddenly he's good friends with Chuck and Nancy, and they're on a first-name basis. So one of the strategies that the narcissists also use is controlling the narrative. So they're not going to listen to the detractors. They're not going to listen to the criticism. And you can see just from the public life of President Trump over the past few months is how he controls the narrative. He has self-serving re-election rallies during his first few months in office because he knows it's very unlikely. Now, there have been protesters, which he has had removed because he's controlling the narrative, but he knows that the majority of people there are going to be clapping right along with him for him. And the fire marshal lie. This is one that we've seen repeatedly anytime he has a rally. He'll tell the crowd that there are people waiting outside, but the fire marshal has said no more people can come in. And that's the Phoenix rally that he had. You can see all that space in the back. So again, there's the presence of conflicting evidence to the lies that he is saying, but he has this alternative reality where the case is, no, people are clamoring to get in to see him. And then the other thing is to play softball with supporters like Sean Hannity, and I said see also the Huckabees because he has two Huckabees that are actually helping further his cause. He has Mike Huckabee, who we could also have an entire town hall about. And he has Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who is basically parroting the lies that he is producing. So I mentioned this quasi-delusional state. So when you think about a delusional state, usually that means psychosis or schizophrenic type behavior where you have false beliefs. It's a little bit of a different quality with the narcissist in that it is more based on what's happening at that moment. So that's why it's quasi-delusional and not delusional. But what I want to point out is it's remarkable the degree to which the extreme narcissist will go to maintain the lie. So you heard the term fake news presented very early on, and now he's gone even as far to say that he's going to take away NBC's license, which he can't do, but the extremes that he's going to go to control the narrative and to keep that lie, those lies going. Any plausible defense to the extreme narcissist will be provided regardless of how unlikely it is. And this is just some examples of how it's really devolved in the last few months. He's talking about fake news. He's talking about the Senate Intel Committee, which is looking at him, should be looking at NBC. So what you also see there is the psychological term projection, where you project what's actually happening to you onto somebody else, or your thoughts and feelings onto someone else. And then this came out this week. It's frankly disgusting the way the press is able to write whatever they want to write, even if it's true, and people should look into it. So I mentioned the lack of empathy and sociopathy and sadism, and you can see in his responses to the crises that we had and we are currently experiencing, paper towel tossing to the crowd in Puerto Rico, asking questions like, what's your death count, shows a complete lack of empathy. And these are just some examples that I pulled from Twitter, just highlighting that point. But this also points out the sadistic undertones of his tweets as well. We cannot keep FEMA, the military and first responders who have been amazing under the most difficult circumstances in Puerto Rico forever. Actually, we can. There are mechanisms in place to keep them there as long as they need to be. And he made that statement with regard to Texas. For some reason, Puerto Rico is different. And we can all speculate as to why Puerto Rico might be different. Representative Joe Kennedy had this to say with the unilateral executive order, which he just signed the other day, that really dismantles the ACA. POTUS continues to segregate the sick and the suffering from wealthy and healthy. We are stronger and kinder than that. And then this is a statement, again, getting to the sadism and to the core of the extreme narcissism from Donald Trump a few years ago. It makes me feel so good to hit the sleazebags back, much better than seeing a psychiatrist, which he never has. And then this is my co-author again, David Reese, who tweeted this the other day. And this really sort of highlights the shift that we need to be thinking about in terms of the fitness or the lack of fitness for duty. Is it's less about narcissism now and more about the sadism. So this came to mind the other day when I was going through my Twitter feed. If you've seen the movie The Princess Bride, came out in 1987 by Rob Reiner, who is a staunch opponent of the president. This is one of the characters, Wesley, who took on the role as the Dread Pirate Roberts. And the Dread Pirate Roberts kept Wesley as a prisoner for many years. And he would tell him, "Good night, Wesley. Good work. Sleep well. I'll most likely kill you in the morning." And this came to mind when I saw one of Trump's recent tweets where he had military leaders at the Oval Office, and he said, maybe it's the calm before the storm. And this, again, is about 10 o'clock at night. Maybe it's the calm before the storm. The press asks him, what is the storm? What are you talking about? And he says, you'll find out. I'll most likely kill you in the morning. So I'm making a joke there, but the point is the danger and the harm and the lack of fitness by this man. So how do you not handle a malignant narcissist? Well, you don't validate, you don't normalize, and you don't display complicity. And this is the executive order signing the other day where he's surrounded by people clapping their hands. You're validating somebody who lives in an alternative reality. How do you handle a malignant narcissist? Confront, confront, confront. You keep speaking out. You keep presenting the opposing evidence. You join advocacy groups. You send letters to your congressman. You speak up. And these are just some examples of people who are doing something about it. So obviously Bob Mueller, David Jolly, who is a Republican, was a Republican representative from Florida, who has been very vocal about Trump not being a Republican. Rick Wilson, also a Republican strategist, who has come out and said how dangerous this president is. Bob Corker and his statements recently have shown this. There's Adam Schiff, who is leading a lot of the efforts against Trump. And then I wish that picture wasn't as small because I don't want to minimize that, but the public demonstrations help bring down Nixon, and I believe they are going to play a key role in moving our agenda forward with this president. So the key danger is when presented with irrefutable evidence that the world is fantastical, the extreme narcissist will seek to create even more of an irrational distance from reality. And that's the danger. That's the threats of war. That's the tweets. That's the decertifying the Iran deal. So one thing I do want to point out, because it has been thrown around in the popular media and on social media, we can't see anything about the cognitive state of the president. That is something that you do need to have a workup done, a neuropsychological workup. He has shown some evidence recently of showing, let's just say, impairment by not being able to find the limo when he got off of Air Force One, walking out of the room before signing an executive order. And just yesterday, he said, I met with the president of the Virgin Islands, which is him. So these could be any number of things. It could be that he's so narcissistic and so wrapped up in his own world that he's not paying attention to the details. It could be his age, it could be decline, but we don't know that. What we do know is that there are consequences to things like this. So I hope I didn't go too far over time. I thank you all for your attention, and we will move on to the next speaker. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Drew Westen, who is getting himself set up right now. Dr. Westen is a professor in the Department of Psychology and Psychiatry at Emory University. His major areas of research are personality disorders, adolescent psychopathology, political psychology, psychotherapy and effectiveness, and the interface of psychodynamics and neuroscience. An active clinician, researcher, and political consultant, Dr. Westen is the principal investigator or co-investigator for 2 grants from the National Institutes of Mental Health. His book, The Political Brain, The role of emotion in deciding the fate of the nation has had a wide influence on elections nationally and internationally. He has advised a wide range of candidates and organizations, from presidential campaigns to the U.S. House and Senate caucus, and has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, and a range of other publications. We're privileged to have him with us today to speak about Donald Trump's functional disabilities and to paint an empirically derived portrait of a malignant narcissist. Thank you, Dr. Westen.
I'm in a funny position as someone who has been both a political consultant for the last several years and consulted a lot to the House and Senate Democratic caucuses, as well as to a number of organizations on message. I have not been consulting to the Democrats recently on message, and I think they could use a little help, a little psychological help at the moment. But they have a clown show going on in the White House, so that's keeping people pretty busy. And I think the attitude at the moment is to sort of hang back and just let him hang himself. The other side of this is that I actually got into politics coming from clinical psychology and psychiatry, it was my main research has been on diagnosis, and particularly of personality disorders and how to classify and diagnose personality disorders, which of course made a segue to politics extremely easy. Except that it was limiting because it narrowed me to narcissistic and psychopathic, and it's kind of boring after a while. But this president certainly has his features of those things. I'm actually going to give a somewhat nonpartisan presentation because I'm going to talk about how to think about what you would think about in terms of the 25th Amendment. When is someone unfit, and how do we determine that in a way that is not just like with Goldwater? All right, he seemed like a lunatic to anybody on the left, but Ronald Reagan was his understudy and became president of the United States, and he wasn't a lunatic. He was dementing, but he wasn't a lunatic. He just had ideas that were all wrong, and had we've been suffering. He tripled the national debt from the time of George Washington all the way up through Jimmy Carter, which is pretty impressive. And the only man to double the national debt ever since was George W. Bush. So the two who said that they were going to be fiscal conservatives didn't do it, and Bill Clinton balanced the budget his last 4 years. So there you go. What I do want to talk about, first of all, the fact that there are pictures existing of this man, and it's not uncommon, that look like this. I mean, I just want to mention that there is no other president you will ever see who would have a picture like that. Did you remember when the primaries started, when it was him and Hillary Clinton? You see Hillary Clinton putting on her fake face, which is, this is another whole story. But then you'd see him putting on this face. It's like, what are you, like a really bad version of Mike Tyson or something? The prize fighter who bit off Evander Holyfield's ear. I mean, what are you trying to display? I actually had no idea. But it is bizarre when you think about it, that there's a picture like that out there. It's not just one. That's a picture. It looks certainly like a picture of a disturbed man. I wasn't going to say anything about how we got here, but I will just say 2 or 3 words about that. And that is that I think we got here from a failure of both the Democrats and the Republicans, to be perfectly honest, in 2 ways. One is that, or 2 or 3 ways. One of them is that the Republicans, well, the Democrats for 50 years controlled the House and the Senate because it was after Roosevelt and the New Deal, and people, frankly, like my mom, who ate because of Franklin Roosevelt, and her family would huddle around the radio and listen to his fireside chats. And it just gave them a tremendous sense of security. And it also actually gave them food. And after that, when he set up that idea that, we need a powerful federal government to rein in these sons of a bitch on Wall Street, and we're going to do it. And we need a powerful federal government so that if the private sector can't create jobs, then the public sector is going to step in and do it. We need a powerful federal government that's going to protect your dignity in later life. Those are all things that he did, and for 50 years, it was his paradigm and his understanding of that he didn't come in with. I mean, he was very open with the country in his inaugural address. If you ever read it, it was relatively brief, but he basically said, as he said in his fireside chats, I'm gonna experiment. I don't know the answers of what to do. I got some ideas. I've got some really smart people around me, and we're gonna do our best. But what I can promise you is that when an idea works, we're gonna stick with it, and when it doesn't, we're gonna get rid of it. And that is exactly what he did. He took an experimental approach to social programs and looked for the ones that were actually helping and the ones that weren't. And for 50 years, Americans were grateful and passed down that legacy. Well, then over time, a couple of things occurred. One was that that it's hard to imagine this, but back in the early 1960s, it was a jump ball as to which party was going to be the party that took up the cause of civil rights. I mean, it's now, to anyone who doesn't know the history, it seems bizarre. But the Republicans had been the party of Lincoln, and actually, there were a number of people like George Romney who were, back in the days when Republicans were normal. Republican senators and representatives were normal, and governors in his case. That Governor Romney, and actually the Governor Romney of Massachusetts, who then twisted himself into a pretzel to try to appease the lunatic fringe, who are now 40% of the Republican Party, that Fox News created a monster and now doesn't know what to do with because they created a whole group of people have a completely alternative view of reality that has nothing to do with the truth. And now they don't know how to rein them in, and it's costing the Republicans. And big reason why Donald Trump, I think, won the Republican nomination was because the Republicans have devolved into, it used to be that you could say, and I've watched this in doing message testing with about 100,000 people over the last 10 years, 100,000 Americans. And what I've seen is that Ronald Reagan message of lower taxes, smaller government, powerful military, faith and family, that idea, that was on a 0 to 60 scale, that was about around 60 to 65 when I first started testing messages against it. 60 to 65 is a really good message. You're really happy if that's what the average person's rating. If you think about it, that means that that you're looking at a lot of Reagan Democrats, and you're looking at a lot of people who self-identify as moderate Democrats or as weak Democrats are saying, I like that. But over about a 5, 6, 7 year period, that message, which has been the dominant paradigm that presidents have had to work through over the last 30 to 40 years, just as Eisenhower said he was a New Dealer. He said anyone who doesn't believe in the New Deal is an idiot. And that was Eisenhower's words. He built the our system of interstate highways. Richard Nixon created the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. They were all working within Roosevelt's paradigm. But then there was this jump ball about civil rights, and the Democrats took it. It was actually the bravery of Lyndon Johnson who was the one who recognized that what he was doing. He whispered to his aide, who I actually know who he is, but I don't think he wants people to know, so I won't tell you that. But anyway, I like to keep secrets because I'm sadistic, just like Seth Scott. But he whispered to his aide that when he signed the Voting Rights Act of 1964 or the Civil Rights Act of '64, he said we're going to lose Democrats the population as Democrats for a generation. And the only way that he was wrong was it was actually about 8 generations. But what ended up happening with the Republican side is, so they've now devolved. I mean, it's clear that there's no ideology left on the right. You've got this 40% who are just lunatic fringe and who believe everything that Roger Ailes taught them when he wasn't busy groping women. And then there's another big chunk of the Republican Party that is actually really normal people. Many of them consider themselves fiscal conservatives. Many of them are socially more progressive, but they consider themselves more fiscally conservative, even though they vote for people who double and triple the national debt. But they're not crazy people. I mean, they're normal, I mean, there could even be some in this room. But now you see what happened first to McCain and then happened to Mitt Romney, which is you had two reasonably sensible people who I wouldn't have been afraid of either one of them as president. I mean, if Mitt Romney, the governor, had been president, he was actually to the left of Barack Obama. If you watch the first debate between the two of them, I was thinking maybe I'm going to vote for Romney because actually I prefer the guy who's more progressive. And he was the one who was further to the left. And then he was obviously told by his advisors, you better talk to the lunatics next time. And he talked to the lunatics the next time. It was like, so you saw both of them had to twist themselves into pretzels to try to say crazy things that would appeal to the crazy base and then somehow try to keep the reality-oriented base with them, and they haven't been able to do it. So their paradigm has devolved. But so has the Democrats, and that's the problem, is that Reagan broke down the New Deal ideology when he used a combination of speaking to a mixture of racism in talking about social programs. He and Nixon really pulled off the Southern strategy of able-bodied welfare loafers and Cadillac driving welfare queens and all that kind of stuff that they used. And they mixed that in with a critique of big government and high taxes that appealed to a lot of people, but had elements of truth to it. The problem is once you start a program, it gets to constituency. And this is not what Roosevelt did. Roosevelt would test out a program, and if it didn't work, I mean, a perfect example is, what's that program that they developed? Project DARE. You know the one I'm talking about? The one where you bring in these former addicts and police to come talk to young people. And we spent billions of dollars a year on that program. Turned out when it got evaluated, it worked for the first 6 months and had no impact later on. I remember getting all that. You probably all remember that, getting that anti-drug propaganda when we were in, like 6th grade and really believing it. And then 7th grade, we were smoking dope. So it was real effective for 6 months, and then other stuff kicks in, teenagehood kicks in, etc. But so the Democrats have in many ways devolved into this group that after Reagan came in, they didn't know what to say. And so they weren't saying what they used to say, which is what they stand for, which is a different concept of broader concept of security than Republicans think about. They think about, Democrats used to think about it, and they do, but they don't ever enunciate their values. They always talk about their issues and their 10-point plans. And, every time I talk to them, I try to say, listen, no one wants to hear your 10-point plan. They want to know two things about you. One is, do you understand and care about people like them? And second is, do you share their values? That's what they want to know. And if they say yes to both of those, you're going to win. If they say no to either one of them, you're going to lose. And it's not your issues should flow from your values, not vice versa. So, why do you care about a $15 an hour minimum wage? You care about it because you believe that no one should have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to put food on the table for their family. Well, for God's sake, say that instead of, I believe in a $15 minimum wage. Start with what you believe in and then say, and here's a way we can do that. If everyone gets a $15 minimum wage, no one's going to have to take 2 or 3 jobs just to put food on the family, on the table for the family. So the Democrats have gotten away in that sense and have devolved in a lot of ways into a coalition instead of having a shared moral view or ideology. But the other thing that I think has really hampered both parties and made a guy like Trump able to become elected is that we've really seen, the average American has seen correctly, and I can tell you from seeing checks handed over the table that are just extraordinary, that lobbyists can give people as campaign contributions, or legalized bribery as the average American sees it, if you speak to them about it that way, is that, who you want to vote for, the party of big oil or the party of Wall Street. And that's really, Wall Street's given their money to the Democrats. That's why no bankers went to jail or went to prison after 2008. And, the right's giving its money to, the oil companies are giving money to people like, Trump, because he got the mantle of Republicans. But that's not a great choice to have to make. We're supposed to be able to vote for someone who's for us, who's for ordinary Americans, and neither party is doing that. And they can say whatever the hell they want, but frankly, when you're bought off, there's nothing you can do about it. You either stand for not being bought off, or you don't. And Trump had this unbelievably brilliant way of doing it, which was early on. He said, "No one can buy me. I'm too rich." And so he was able to talk like a populist, as the right-wing version of a populist, when Bernie Sanders was talking as the left-wing version of a populist. And, if Bernie Sanders had not had the crazy hair and the Brooklyn accent, he would have beaten Hillary Clinton, and he would have beaten the crap out of Donald Trump, because both of them were speaking to the same populist urge of, let's get special interests out of Washington, and let's instead have, if they want to contribute to our politics, they can contribute to a matching fund. And that matching fund will go to anyone who starts to get their neighbors interested in getting them elected, and we'll match it. There's actually a plan of it. Anyway, I wasn't going to talk about any of that, but now I'll finally get to what I was going to talk about. Sorry about the digression. I do want to start with something Seth mentioned about he talked about the Goldwater rule, and the question about whether psychologists or psychiatrists or other mental health professionals can offer diagnostic opinions on politicians. By the way, can you hear me okay? Everybody? Okay. So I completely agree that in general, we do not want Dr. Phil and Dr. Laura and Dr. whoever, we don't want CNN crowded out, with their 24-hour news cycle, with bringing on one lunatic psychologist after another, giving their psychologized view that's really just a rationalization of what they don't like about the other team. That is not a useful way for a democracy to go, any more than it's useful to have a lunatic in the White House. But there are circumstances when I believe that rule has to be broken. I will tell you that in anticipation of writing a piece, I hope for the Times, the Sunday Times, and this actually, I want to thank Susan and Lynn for organizing this, because they made me organize my thoughts to put together a presentation. Been meaning to write this for some time. And this is the first year that I am not licensed as a clinical psychologist. I let my license lapse in large measure because I thought I would need to write this. So that was a decision in January, and it's actually pretty difficult to get your license back after you've let it lapse. But at the moment, I'm doing more political consulting than I am. I obviously can't do patient work now. But I think the best example of when that rule needed to be broken was in 1984. I can see that there's a good handful of you who are around and probably remember the first debate between Walter Mondale and Ronald Reagan. And it was crystal clear to me at that time as a graduating PhD student that he was demented. There was no question that he had all the early warning signs of dementia. And I wasn't even trained as a neuropsychologist. frankly, I don't think it really took, much training at all. I think the average layperson could see it. And what we saw then was exactly what we're seeing now, and that was political pundits trying to figure out and make sense of something that was not a political question. It was really a psychiatric and neurological question. And the American Neurological Association should have stood up because they saw that the man was dementing, and they should have taken a stand as an organization and said, we're not advocating anything other than the evaluation of this president, because we have seen enough signs from that one debate that he cannot remember a thing. He cannot hold a thought in mind. You're seeing all of the warning signs of dementia. And I used to write comedy music. And back in 1981, I wrote a song called the Ronald Reagan Rag. And the first line, interestingly, so it was obvious at that time that he was showing early warning signs, and I was just starting graduate school, so it's not like I had a lot of knowledge. But the first line was, my name is Ronald Reagan and I got a job to do. My senility doesn't bother me if it doesn't bother you. But that was in his first year of office. So I believe this was a major lapse by physicians in particular in 1984, and I think it would be a major lapse now for mental health professionals not to do what John Gartner has organized so many people to do, and that there's 63,000 signatures is extraordinary. But what I do want to do is I do want to make the rest of this completely nonpartisan, because I don't think this is a partisan issue. It becomes one really quickly, but it shouldn't. Because if I saw a Democrat like this, I would say get him evaluated and get him evaluated well, and get all of that data to the members of the cabinet, because they need to see whether or not they need to remove the president. There is a kicker that I'm going to end with on this one about succession and about a possible constitutional crisis. So we have the same questions today that we had in 1984. The question with Trump is actually different. With Reagan, it was, is he declining? And in 1984, it was really, really clear that he was declining. And even, if you go back, Seth talked about normalization and about. I went back to try to find. I was going to show today that a couple pieces of that video from Ronald Reagan from 1984. From that, really, it was a tragic debate to watch, because you were watching a man's brain dissolve, except that he was president of the United States, which is not a good place to have your brain dissolve. And what was really, really concerning to me was all I could find in YouTube when I searched for that was the next debate, where he came up, where he remembered long enough the line that I'm not going to hold your. He was asked about age, and he said, to Mondale, I'm not going to hold your youth and inexperience against you. And everybody laughed. But when I rewatched that on YouTube, he had trouble getting that line out because he had trouble remembering it. And that line was the one that was just the one that sort of wiped that issue off the map, and he took off again in the polls. But actually, if you watch that carefully, he was showing signs of dementia, soft signs of dementia, as he was delivering that line. He was fumbling over it in a way that actor Ronald Reagan never fumbled over anything, and the orator Ronald Reagan never fumbled over anything. The difference is today that we also have a president who the question is not just whether he's declining, but it's whether he has certain functional disabilities, and that's what I'll be talking about today. Whenever he got them. And he has probably had them for a very long time, probably his whole life. Personality disorders do not typically emerge in the 70s. They typically emerge, but if you don't have them by the time you're about 16 years old, you're not going to get one unless you get a serious head injury, and then you can get something that looks like a personality disorder, behaves like a personality disorder, but actually isn't one. So the question is, can clinicians offer diagnostic opinions or judgments without meeting a patient? And my answer to this is I think in many ways, there goes Pence again, is similar to Seth's. And the first answer is, it's the norm in many medical specialties. How many of you have ever had a radiologist talk with you? I mean, most of the time you see your physician because you've got some kind of, you've got something, your foot's been bothering you, it's swollen, it's been going on for a couple of weeks, it's not going away. You go in and you see your physician might refer you to the podiatrist, but one of them is going to say, all right, let's get your foot x-rayed. You get it x-rayed, the radiologist does not see you there, a tech does the x-ray. The radiologist then reads the film. The radiologist takes a look at the film, sees a little hairline fracture, and if, say, it's your 12-year-old daughter who's doing dance, and what the radiologist has heard is that she does dance, and that she does it 5 times a week, and that she's had no trauma to her foot, he'll say, I see evidence of a hairline fracture. It is probably, given that history, due to, probably a stress fracture. And this is what I would recommend that she do for the next few weeks. Now, that is an opinion offered by someone who has never spoken a word to that patient. It's given back then to the physician. And the physician then also reads the chart, sees it, and may even show it to you and say, can you see right there what none of us could have seen before, but now you can see? With Trump, it's a little more obvious than that, what those hairline fractures are, because they're not hairline. As far as the ability to, what can a trained psychologist see? Well, when I saw, and I think this is true of most lay people, but certainly I can say this as a PhD psychologist who spent a lifetime studying diagnoses and how to make them and how to think about and observe, is when I saw the sort of self video of that mass murderer from, was it Colorado, in the movie theater? Was it Colorado? Yeah. I can't imagine many of you had a different response than I did. It was obvious to me that he was psychotic. Which brand of psychotic I can't diagnose, but I can certainly tell you he is psychotic. I mean, his behavior and his mannerisms, his nonverbal behavior, his verbal behavior, and it went on for about 30, 45 minutes consistently. You could not fake that. It would be extremely difficult to fake all that unless you were a PhD or MD and you really studied schizophrenia and you really learned to play the part. But his behavior was clearly psychotic. And I can offer, as a psychologist, from a distance, correctly, the diagnostic opinion. And I'm not saying I'm going to diagnose him as having schizophrenia versus schizoaffective disorder. I can tell you he is psychotic. His thinking is psychotic, his mannerisms are psychotic, his behavior is psychotic, and it is highly likely that what he did in that movie theater was not done because he was some angry guy who just knew in advance that Harvey Weinstein was going to turn out to be groping people. It was that he was psychotic. And similarly, you can see a lot of, psychologists routinely code things, narratives, for example, or videos, that are just as brief as, a lot more brief than what we see, as Seth was saying, of Mr. Trump. For qualities like the qualities that I'm about to talk about with Mr. Trump, and that is things like, that are complex, like how well can this person, on say a coding from a manual on a 5-point scale, to what extent can this person take another person's perspective, imagine another person's point of view? To what extent does this person tend to hold benign versus malevolent views of people? To what extent can a person's narratives that they tell you something about, you see that at some point there's a peculiar change in syntax, or there's a change in emotion that doesn't belong there, or there isn't an emotion that should belong there. those things are all, as a clinician, those are all the cues that you use, that you ask about when you see that happen. And those are things that you can code highly reliably. And in fact, undergraduates can actually code nonverbal behaviors with high reliability that then predict things like how well a TA does by the end of the term in student evaluations. They can do it with the sound off for 30 seconds. And just to be very clear about that, I personally am very concerned about having two people who do not seem like they have all of their marbles, both of whom seem to have bully dynamics. We know it about Trump. We don't know it about Kim Jong-un because we don't really know much about the guy other than what we hear on the media, and God knows, what that means. But to have two people one who is terrified of being bombed with nuclear weapons, but has them, and the other who'd like nothing more than to bomb him, likes to call him Rocket Man. That enough, frankly, that would be enough for me to say, take it to the cabinet. Because you do not say to someone whose mind you have no idea what's in it, but you know that he starves his people out so that he can create nuclear weapons and the missiles to deliver them, and he's showing you it over and over and over. You do not tickle that guy by saying, "Hey, Rocket Man." First of all, he doesn't know who Elton John is, so he doesn't know what you're referring to. But second, it is a really, really risky thing to do. And only someone who is extremely disinhibited in his speech would ever consider doing something like that. And frankly, again, this is the first thing I would be looking for if I were doing a neurological examination. Then I'd be studying his frontal lobes, because he shows so much signs of frontal lobe dysfunction. The disinhibition, the complete lack of empathy for people, the lack of concern that Seth was describing for consistency of what he's saying, the willingness to lie and then not to realize that, well, you said something different yesterday, or the data are right there, someone can compare it. Those are things that psychopaths do. Those are things that people with brain damage in the frontal lobes do. He needs a really good evaluation. And there really isn't much of a way around that. But the problem is that we have political pundits talking about it instead of the people who need to be talking about it, which is people who actually know what those things could mean. And again, I don't mean to judge them from afar. All I need to do is to say they do need to be studied in this president. And he does need to step down while they're studied, because what he is doing now is playing with fire. When you say, we're going to do something with North Korea, but I won't tell you about it. Do you know, Kennedy would never have dealt with Khrushchev that way. We would never have dealt with Brezhnev that way. You don't know when you're setting off World War III. Bob Corker is absolutely right that you do not say, I'm not going to tell you if I'm going to blow you up overnight. You don't say that to a guy like Kim Jong-un, and who's up in a corner, up against a bully. I might shoot if I were Kim Jong-un under those circumstances. Because you might take the bet that he's not going to actually use nuclear weapons against you, because that nuclear bomb is actually, the wind is going to carry it over into South Korea and Japan. And so we actually can't use nuclear weapons against them, but he can use nuclear weapons against Japan. So I wouldn't play like that. And that is at the level that he should have been removed from office at that point, because that's simply too dangerous a thing to do, and it does show that he's just too unstable. What I want to suggest is that we, and I'll try to speed this up, is that we ask the right question. And the right question is not what his diagnoses are, but where do you see functional disabilities that are things that a president should have psychologically, intellectually, but in this case doesn't? And are they serious enough that you would say, I'm going to use the codes from red, meaning danger, Will Robinson, for those of you who remember the reference, and then orange for the next level down, yellow for the next level down, and there's not too much green. But so the first question is are his words and behavior consistent with narcissistic personality disorder? Well, to me, the answer to that is yes, but it's not disqualifying. You can have narcissistic personality disorder and be president of the United States and do a reasonably good job. I don't know if we've ever had someone who has it, but I can tell you that anyone who runs for president and believes that they should be the most powerful human being on earth has narcissism, and has a healthy dose of narcissism. And you can be Barack Obama and do a much better job of hiding your narcissism. Trump doesn't even seem to know that anyone else out there can see how just bizarre. And when people refer to it, when Bob Corker referred to it as adult daycare, I mean, that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing the actions of like a little boy who's 4 years old say, "I'm Batman." I mean, that's what it looks like because that's who he is. And that's a pretty serious problem. But you can be a president and have narcissistic personality disorder. And I'll show you in a second. Second question, are his words and behavior consistent with malignant narcissism? And my answer to that would be the same as Seth's, which is yes, and it is highly concerning. Whether it's disqualifying, we'll see in a second, and that's a matter of judgment. But I would say now we're into at least the orange zone, heading red. Next question I would ask is, are his words and behavior consistent with narcissistic delusions? That is, grandiose delusions, which are a form of psychotic thinking. The answer to that is yes. And that is highly concerning or disqualifying depending on the content. And as I'll show you in a second, it bothers me a great deal that this president can imagine that he had a bigger crowd at his inauguration than Barack Obama, the first African-American president of the United States, who was there, and it stretched back for, as far as the eye could see. And for Trump, it stretched as far as his little hands could see. So, and that seems to be a problem for him. But that is in fact a grandiose delusion. You cannot say that, make that statement, and appear as he does to believe it, and to keep repeating it. And the same thing that he really won the popular vote. I mean, those things are grandiose delusions. It is highly concerning that a president has grandiose delusion because it suggests that in the way he weighs that, first of all, that he's got psychotic processes going on in his head, probably disqualifying. But the one that got me that I'll show you in a second is and this is when I decided not to renew my license, was back in, I think it was October of 2016, when Bob Gates, who had been the chief of the CIA under both Barack Obama and George W. Bush, came out criticizing Trump. And Trump responded by saying, "I know so much more about national security intelligence than Bob Gates." When I heard that, this is now a psychotic delusion that is dangerous, because what it suggested to me is exactly what's happened, which is he ignores the intelligence that comes from our intelligence agencies, and he instead watches Fox News and Breitbart and reads Breitbart. So that is disqualifying. I mean, having a delusion that a man who has run the CIA for 8 years, that you just magically have so much brilliance that you can see things better than he can when you've had no briefings yet. That is crazy, and it is crazy in a very, very particular way. Are his words and behaviors consistent with persecutory delusions, that is, paranoid delusions? The answer to that one, I'll show you in a second, is yes, and it is disqualifying to be president of the United States. Does he have functional disabilities or impairments that render him incapable of safely serving as president? And my answer to that, again, is yes, and it is disqualifying. Now I just want to show you those. I'm going to run through them as quickly as I can. Just some examples of the required intellectual functions of a president. One of them is general intelligence. I only gave that a code yellow, and that's because, we've had pretty stupid presidents before. I've heard that Calvin Coolidge wasn't the brightest guy in the world, but he didn't blow the world up. Of course, he couldn't blow the world up. George W. Bush was certainly one of our dumber presidents, and in fact, that was problematic. There has been no other president in American history who, at the same time as crashing the domestic economy to the extent that whether it was a recession or a depression was just a matter of how you called it, at the same time as destroying the international world order by blowing up the Middle East. I mean, no one has ever done that before in 225 years of American history. Historians are already putting him in the bottom 5 of 45, and they never do that to a president who's recent because it seems too political. They're doing it because he deserved it, because he was an idiot, and he did what idiots do. And when you have someone who's a certifiable moron as president, they will do moronic things. And I'll tell you, when their Secretary of State tells you they're a moron, we should be pretty concerned. But I haven't done an IQ test on him, man. I don't know. And you would have to do one. And, personally, I think presidents should have IQs above 100. That's average. I think it would be a good idea if you're the most powerful human being on earth, maybe to get up to 103 or 104. I don't know where Mr. Trump is, and I don't feel like I can evaluate that from seeing him, because who knows what comes from his advisors, from him, what he just heard on Fox, God knows. Knowledge base, that's something that Seth mentioned. He is completely indifferent to learning anything. That is a really serious concern. I would make that code red. And it's code red in the same way that it was code red for George W. Bush, who had the same complete lack of curiosity, except that he at least listened to his national security advisors. Well, except for that one time when he got that little memo that said, this fellow named Bin Laden's is trying to attack us on American soil. And he got this presidential briefing paper, and he said, oh, yeah, no worry about him. I never heard of him anyway. That's a real problem with the president. And this president in particular, what George W. Bush did not have was an indifference to saying things that were exactly the opposite of each other. That man was consistent all the way through. I believe he was consistently stupid. I believe his policies were consistently wrong-headed. But he stuck with them, and it wasn't like he would just make up new things each time. That's a huge difference. Attention. This is pretty worrisome about the president. Now, the reason I gave this only an orange is because I have not evaluated him. I do not know what his attention span is. I don't know, we've heard from the media, what's true, what's not true, from his advisors. That's something you'd have to actually meet with him and evaluate. Cognitive impulsivity. His jumping to conclusions and jumping from one thought to the next and saying it, or even jumping to it and believing it, that's code red. You cannot, that's again what Seth talked about, is this complete inconsistencies in what he'll say, and people say, whoever spoke to him last, that's what he believes. That's really, really worrisome in the president. And you do see it in him, that lack of any concern for consistency of his statements. That is really worrisome. And the fact, I'm not even getting into his lying. That's just because they assume that you don't deliberately lie. But something about that lying is just important to note. Diagnostically, it is very difficult to tell with this president, as it is with some patients, whether they are at any given point lying and knowing they're lying, which he does, whether they're lying and then convincing themselves that it's the truth, which I think he does, or whether they are lying in the sense that it's a complete falsehood, but they simply want to believe it and they never considered the truth. He does that too. And I think those things are fluid with him. And you do see that with a range of different disorders. You see it most actually, and you see it often in psychopaths, where you can't tell when they're consciously lying or when they're just so good at conning that they believe themselves. You also see it in some bipolar patients, where especially while an episode, if they're in a relatively mild episode, you really don't know whether they're lying to you or not, in which sense. Is this getting too boring? Should I wrap it up or should I staying awake? All right, I'll just go through a few more of these. Behavioral impulsivity is something differently. And again, once again, I'd give this a code red. And the reason I give this a code red is because when you do something like taunt Kim Jong-un with, something big is going to happen, but I'm not going to tell you. You are asking for him to blow up Tokyo. And that's what you're doing. And he should have been removed immediately after he did that. That was something that any normal person could see with no training. Any layperson could see that was crazy. That is something you do not do. It was a psychotic thing to do, and it also is something that represents a really severe level of not only sadism, which I think Seth was right about, but also just complete disinhibition, that you can let something like that roll off your tongue. Assessing information based on credibility of source is something that Seth talked about. Code red. He doesn't distinguish between national security briefings and Breitbart. Well, you can't have a president who does that. We all, sensible people, all say, well, I've read the New York Times and I've read the New York Post. And unless you're in that 40% crowd, that Fox has created, you say, the Times does do things like, I can tell you, it's a pain in the ass when you write opinion pieces for them. They actually do, they'll check. I mean, if you say that it was, that there are 49.5 million people who didn't have health care back before the ACA, which is a horrible name, as is Obamacare. They need a little messaging help on those things. But if you say something like that, they will say, where did you get that number from? And we've got this other number that says it's 47.3, and why is there a discrepancy? Post couldn't give a shit. I mean, there's whatever's in there is in there. And Breitbart, it's like whatever serves his agenda. Perspective taking. This again is such a red flag and code red. He cannot imagine another person's mind. And if you cannot imagine another person's mind, you cannot be president, because you're dealing with foreign leaders all the time. Even our allies. I mean, put away Kim Jong-un for a second, where you really ought to try to get the best intelligence you can on what makes that guy tick, and not just go, Rocket Man. I mean, you really want to know. But even dealing with our allies, you don't make America great again by having us our president no longer being considered the leader of the free world, and not someone who anybody else who's sensible would ever follow, because he's nuts, or he's stupid, or he's impulsive, or whatever it is that he is at that moment that needs to be evaluated. The ability to distinguish fact from desired fact, another code red. Now, on this one, we all have this problem, which is, we all, frankly, we all see ourselves through, not all, there's a handful of people on the depressive side of things who see themselves with negatively tinted glasses. But over 50% of people believe that they are better than average on virtually every trait you ask them about. Well, over 50% of people can't be better than average. So, we all have self-serving biases in the way we see ourselves. Again, there's a subset of people who are depressive, who have depressive personality styles, and they're about 20% on the other side. But that makes the rest of us actually even more self-serving in our biases. But, the difference between remembering our algebra grade from when we were in 9th grade or 8th grade as an A when it was really a B, versus remembering that you got 3 million more votes than you did, that's a huge difference. One is delusional, and the other is just the normal self-serving biases that human beings have. Just to start wrapping up, criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. I don't know how many of those that you can't see them at all, but because I don't know why this is showing both sides of the screen. But there are things like, actually, Seth gave us all of them except he added sadism, which is not in that list because he gave us these for malignant narcissism. But you can have, this president. Grandiose sense of self, preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, believes that she is special and unique, requires excessive admiration, ... I don't think I've ever seen anyone who not only meets 9 out of these 9 criteria, but meets another 14. You know, I mean, he's off the chart, this narcissistic personality disorder. But you know, again, I first started thinking about his mental health when he started to take off, and I got a call from one of the networks, and they wanted me to do a segment with their anchor on the nightly news about you know, Trump's psychology. And I spoke to the anchor and I said, you know, here's the problem for me. And I was taking the Goldwater rule very seriously at the time. It was also before he started doing things like that statement about Bob Gates. I would have responded differently at that point. But, you know, I said to her at the time, look, he's got a narcissistic personality disorder. It's obvious. I mean, he advertises it. It's like, you know, I mean, Trump has to be on it. I mean, I'm sure he's got all of his underwear is monogrammed. You know, monogrammed is, you know, saying Trump. Probably, you know, right in his crotch where his tiny little hands are. You know, he's got Trump everywhere. He can't name anything without Trump at the top. It's like he's got to remind himself all the time that Trump is here. You know, that's, you know, just an extraordinary form of narcissism. But again, that's not disqualifying for a president. It's not good in a president. It looks really bad in a president. Those rallies that he holds are just, you know, they give you the creeps because you don't hold rallies to admire yourself. That's the kind of thing that Mussolini did. You know, that's what's worrisome about him, is that combination, that Seth was getting at this, that combination of looking for a scapegoat group, sadism, and populism, mixed together with this excessive need to be admired. You're starting to move into sort of the fascist authoritarian type person. And he is dangerous that way, except that I think he's too crazy to be dangerous that way. Well, I take it back. I think he could do some really awful things. In terms of malignant narcissism, I actually had forgotten that about 5-6 years ago in my lab, we did that was actually longer ago, it was 2008. We did a study on subtyping narcissistic personality disorder empirically. We had a sample of about 200 patients with narcissistic personality disorder. And we used an empirical procedure to try to see if there were groupings within them. In fact, there was a grouping that showed up that was obviously malignant narcissism, the way clinicians had described it for years. I just want to point out a handful of the criteria that are different from just regular old narcissistic personality disorder. Tends to blame own failures or shortcomings on other people or circumstances. Attributes his or her difficulties to external factors rather than accepting responsibility for conduct or harm. Sounds like something Seth told us about. And we've certainly seen with him, I mean, he blames Congress all the time. You know, hey, you didn't get your repeal of Obamacare done, dude. You know, that's on you too. It's, you know, you didn't convince enough of your Republican colleagues, I'll be nice about that, tends to have extreme reactions to perceived slights or criticism, e.g. may react with rage, humiliation, etc. I mean, you couldn't define him better than that. Tends to get into power struggles, I think we could say that. Tends to hold grudges, may dwell on insults or slights for long periods. That gets back to that holding something in mind for 2 years like it's the present. Tends to be manipulative, you know, using Mexicans and undocumented immigrants as a scapegoat group when you know yourself, because you've talked about it, that it's actually the people who've bought the political system who are causing everybody so much insecurity in their jobs. That's the problem, and that and globalization, which we haven't dealt with. But to find that group, that's what you see in right-wing populism. By the way, the difference between left-wing populism and right-wing populism is that they both speak to the gut-level feelings of ordinary people in that country, that they're feeling insecure, that they're feeling worried, about their future, about their kids' future. And both say, there's this group of people up there who's controlling things. And it usually happens when that is true. But right-wing populism always says, and there's this group of people below you who can make your self-esteem go up because they're smaller and browner than you, you know, or you know they're cleaning your bathrooms, or you know in some way they are inferior to you, and therefore you can feel better about yourself. It's really the difference between right and left-wing populism. And just another couple of things, tends to feel misunderstood, mistreated, or victimized. Fake news. is prone to intense anger out of proportion to the situation at hand, correspondence dinner, and experiences little or no remorse for harm or injury caused to others. That is what you get to in malignant narcissism is the psychopathic end of narcissism, where you start to see the kind of conning behaviors and the lack of empathy, lack of concern for truth. Okay, I will wrap this up, except this, I guess I do want to do this slide, then I'll wrap up. And that is the most concerning thing about him to me, from just a diagnostic point of view, and in terms of functional disabilities. And again, that's what I'm focusing on today, is that what can he and can he not do? Or now we're moving to what is, those are often called negative symptoms in psychiatry, meaning something is missing that should be there. Like the capacity to perspective take should be there, but he doesn't have it. Now I'm going to talk about something that's called positive symptoms, things that should not be there, but are, and in this case are severely, severely concerning to the level that I do believe certainly meets what was intended by the 25th Amendment. The general definition of a delusion is this. It's from the DSM-5. A false belief based on incorrect inference about external reality that is firmly held despite what almost everyone else believes and despite what constitutes incontrovertible and obvious proof or evidence to the contrary. Well, they should put Trump's name by that in the DSM. But there are different kinds of delusions. One is grandiose delusions, a delusion of inflated worth, power, knowledge, identity, or special relationship to a deity or famous person. Now, in Trump's case, I at first thought he had narcissistic personality disorder. I do believe that. I do believe he has malignant narcissism. I don't believe that the first disqualifies him. I think the second makes him a pretty bad president. It means we should keep really close reins on him. I'm not sure that would reach the level of disqualification under the 25th Amendment. But, and I actually don't believe that I'm giving this a code orange. I'm being very generous at this point, from this point of view, is that the presence of grandiose delusions makes you really worried about someone. Again, why are psychotic thought processes happening in the mind of our president? They really should not, and if they are there, that's probably disqualified. But when it does get to the level that he says, I know more about national security than Bob Gates, he's out of here. You cannot have someone like that in office, because you know that he will disregard evidence that he absolutely has to believe in, or if he sees that it's wrong in some way, he has to question it. If he sees conflicts between, he's got to say, what just happened there? Why am I hearing this from the FBI and this from the CIA? This is why in the run-up to the year 2000, Bill Clinton and Al Gore held a meeting every morning, first thing every morning, and brought together the heads of the CIA, the FBI, NSA. I think it was about 4 or 5 of the top groups. And Clinton would say every morning, as we led up to the millennium, because Al-Qaeda really wanted to go after something like Times Square on the year 2000. And they had, both Clinton and Gore had actually heard of Al-Qaeda, and they'd heard of bin Laden, which unfortunately George W. Bush a year later had not. But they held this meeting, and they would say, Clinton would say very clearly to the director of the FBI and the CIA every morning, I know you have your turf. I know you have your turf wars. Those are gone now. You are right now going to say anything that you saw that was scary at all. And in 2001, if Gore had been president, and he would have asked that question, when he heard about the flight school, he would have immediately said, well, what have you heard over here? And he would have gotten the full picture, and then we would have known what to do. But you have to have people willing to do that. Anyway, that's trouble. That now becomes, to me, disqualifying. The pre-election, when he also said that he knew more than the generals about ISIS. I mean, again, that's a delusion that that's a dangerous delusion. Because it means you're not going to listen to your generals either. I'm sure his generals did not say taunt Kim Jong-un. That sounds like a great idea. We know so much about his psychology that we know that's going to really be a good thing for him. You want to scare a guy like that? That's the way to do it. Finally, persecutory delusions. A delusion in which the central theme is that one or someone to whom one is close is being attacked, harassed, cheated, persecuted, or conspired against. And again, that's within the context of a false belief that's based on incorrect information. The presence of that is code red and is disqualifying. And the reason I say it, when he said that that President Obama, when he tweeted, where's this? Skip over it. I don't seem to have it. That President Obama was wiretapping him. The belief that the CIA or the FBI is wiretapping you is actually one of the most common statements that gets people institutionalized into psychiatric hospitals. And it should, and there was no evidence for it whatsoever. That enough is disqualified. Imagine if you have persecutory delusions, paranoid delusions, and you've got a guy like Kim out there. You've got Iran out there. You've got all kinds of potential bad actors out there, or people who you imagine are bad actors because you're thinking of killing them, so you imagine they must be thinking of killing you. You just can't have that in the White House. I'll just stop by saying there is a looming question, and that is this. It is not clear to me that we actually need Mueller's investigation at all. I think President Obama waited absurdly late to call as an umpire that all 21 of his national security chiefs had said, his intelligence chiefs had said, this is the Russians, and they are trying to disrupt the election, and they do not like Hillary Clinton, and they are the source of those WikiLeaks. He knew that in July of 2016, and he did not announce it until October. Okay? It was October 6th, but here's the flip side. Flip side of that is he did announce it on October 6th. What he should have added to that, which was implicit, but he did not say it, is, I hope both of you, do it equally, I hope both candidates and everyone working for them will read and reread both the definition in the Constitution and the statute about what constitutes treason. That aiding or abetting our enemies in any way, and in this there is no bigger way to aid or abet our enemies than to disrupt their democracy, is treason. And the statute specifically says, and no one who has committed treason can hold office. Here's the thing. Suppose Mike Pence does invoke the 25th Amendment. He and his running mate, whether he did anything or not himself, were elected through treason, because 150 plus times after October 6th, Donald Trump, as candidate, said, read the WikiLeaks, they're great, they got all this stuff on Hillary Clinton. We already know he committed treason. He was told by the President of the United States, this is from the Russians trying to disrupt their democracy. That's done, you're done. That is treason. There's nothing else to ask about that. So actually, I asked a friend of mine who's a constitutional law professor at Harvard about it. He said, yeah. He said, that's absolutely true. He said, now convincing his 40% base, that's going to be another story. But anyway, we don't have any provision built into our Constitution about what happens if a president is elected by treason. What do you do after that? Do you say, well, all of the electoral votes, all of the electors who voted for him, their votes have to be disqualified, and the other candidate becomes president? It's completely unclear. I will stop with that, and sorry for going on quite so long.
Well, what I want to tell you is, in my little agenda that I carry around, I have a copy of the Constitution. I have 4 or 5 copies because every once in a while I run into somebody who makes a statement about the Constitution. I say, where's it found? And they say, well, it's such a, well, let's take a look at this. And exploding falsehoods is part of my way of being in life. The first thing I want to say is one of the problems that I see is that the media talked about temperament instead of the kinds of severe disability the president has. On August 2nd last year, on the program with Lawrence O'Donnell, he put the 9 criteria for narcissistic personality on the board and said, does this remind you of anyone? Well, God, that was in August 2nd. But they began using the word temperament. Even Obama and Hillary used temperament instead of pushing a little bit further. Well, the 2 things I wanted to mention to you, because you guys did a great job listing the criteria, is that Catholics have a notion of invincible ignorance. Now, invincible ignorance is that ignorance of not wanting to know what the gospel is or be saved, or however you want to talk about it theologically. It is so powerful that even God is powerless against it. And I put that in my essay about Donald Trump, because his desire to remain ignorant is so invincible. He's very well protected. He has his defensive mechanisms writ large. The second thing is, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, when people were trying to describe, when psychologists and psychiatrists were trying to describe persons who apparently lacked a sense of empathy or unscrupulous were, they used the term moral imbecility. And so when I close my discussions of Donald Trump and I decide he is mentally ill, there's one thing I want you to remember: moral imbecility. And that is the tagline I want to leave with you, and thank you for letting me add a little bit to my learned colleagues. You guys did a fantastic job. Thank you.
I look at it in 3 broad categories, and there's some fluidity there. One are diehard Republicans. This was their candidate. They were going to ride this horse because this was their candidate. And you've seen notable deviations from that. We were wrong to stick with our candidate. Then you had another group that was actively ignorant. And I don't want that to sound as negative, but just to describe, actively ignorant, where they bought the message, they bought the red hats, and they weren't going to hear dissension. But then you had the group that was passively ignorant, that weren't aware of the danger that he possessed, and didn't necessarily have access to Twitter, 24/7 news cycles. And so you had these groups that didn't necessarily realize that they were the ones who were going to be hurting by this election. So I think you have those 3 broad groups. And the one thing that doesn't get spoken of much about that I really think is important is some of the psychology at play there comes from cult psychology. So there's a term that's called shared omnipotence. And what that means is that the leader, in this case the candidate, has his followers believe, not only am I the one that's going to take you to the promised land, whatever that promised land is, but if you don't follow me, not only is something bad going to happen to our dynamic, the entire system is going to collapse. So there's this idea that shared omnipotence, that we will do this whatever it takes because we fear what would happen if we don't.
Let me just add to, I think it's a great summary, and I'd add to your comment about shared omnipotence, is that there is that feeling of being great with him. and at a time when people are feeling so insecure, and there's nothing like feeling that kind of greatness. I just add two other things. One is that there has been 30 years of right-wing branding of Hillary Clinton that made her into a witch in people's minds, and that they start. I mean, no other first lady has ever had this happen to her that in that way. And it started, with healthcare, and the whole idea of her. She was embodying this cultural change where women could now choose in the White House if they wanted to be, as she made the mistake of saying, staying home and baking cookies, or taking on the kind of role that she took. But that continued, and she didn't help it by not getting any nonverbal coaching, which she clearly didn't. Not bothering having a message. I mean, I asked my students, what was Trump's message? I was teaching a political psychology class. And it was make America great again. So what was Hillary's? And they were all silent. No one knew. But just to add one last thing to that about Hillary is, I think she's absolutely right about James Comey. Is that no one other than J. Edgar Hoover from that position as director of the CIA has ever had such a profound effect on our country. He knew exactly what he was doing. He left it ambiguous by saying, oh, there's this new thing that just happened, as if, oh, I never knew that Anthony Weiner had a laptop. I mean, that was so planned, and to do it right before the 10 days before the election was I actually have done some work calculating what the effect was, and she would have had 317 electoral votes if he hadn't done that.
Seth, to what extent was confirmation bias a part of the building up this group that you were describing? And maybe people need to know what confirmation bias is.
Would you like to introduce it?
Well, I believe certain things, and I look for people who will agree with me, and that is reinforcing, it's self-reinforcing, and it's a way of managing anxiety. I don't have to be anxious. I can't be anxious because, after all, you all agree with me. And that's how I see confirmation bias, and that's what builds up this base of Trump. Mm-hmm. But I think there was a lady over here who had a question. Didn't you, Julie?
Besides Trump's followers, does anyone ever believe that his cabinet would do anything to him?
Would
His
you?
vice president and cabinet, even if they had all of the information, does anyone believe that they would do anything about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the moron comments are showing what's been known and not necessarily publicized, and that Trump and Tillerson didn't know each other until he was on the cabinet. So there's no loyalty there, and we're seeing more and more often that Trump is undercutting Tillerson.
I don't know. I'm just concerned that how do we actually change this to where the numbers would be in our favor, to where we could get the House of Representatives that could move forward with impeachment. I guess the question is, what's our action plan?
The most important thing for Democrats would be not to do what they did in 2010, which was to allow at the local level of government to allow Republicans to take so many seats and be able to gerrymander for a decade. It's a census year coming up in 2020, which is actually in many ways more important than 2018 because of that. But Republicans are always a step ahead of Democrats. I mean, this was Karl Rove's strategy to go at the local level, win at the local level, and then you get to gerrymander. And then you get to actually make the decisions about abortion clinics and all that kind of stuff that are not made at the federal level. So that's a big part of it. But for 2018, I think the Republicans are going to lose the Senate. I mean, that seems pretty. I think that's pretty clear because the You know, the average American is much as Trump has his, you know, his stalwarts. The average American is pretty anxious about him now. And I mean, when you see somebody like Bob Corker, I mean, he is not a, you know, he's not a leftist. But when you see him come out the way he came out swinging, I think you're right. I think you're right that we're going to see more of that. I mean, I think one of the reasons there's such a feud with Rex Tillerson is because he seems presidential, you know, and Trump seems like adult daycare. But you know, so for 2018, we can't win back the House. I mean, Democrats can't win back the House because the seats are so gerrymandered, and that you know, no one, very few people know this, but for the last decade, when Democrats have lost the House, or 8 years, 6 years since they've lost the House, Democrats have actually won millions more votes across the country in the House, but the way it was gerrymandered made that not count, and that's a pretty serious problem. So the census year is what really matters the most.
Well, you've worked with Democrats at the upper levels, and you made a good point that Trump said, let America be great again, and no new taxes. These are memorable, they're easily repeated. What is the resistance among Democrats for coming up with something similar? How does that work?
Well, there's two forms of it that I've seen from just spending enough time in Washington. One is that there is a very strong interest group, which is pollsters, and what they do is and one of the reasons, and pollsters and the consultants in Washington who are entrenched, who did things like run John Ossoff's campaign. He was not allowed to make a single decision in his own campaign. He ran such a crappy campaign, I think, and he ran, I mean, I don't know what his message was. It was, well, vote for me and I'll be a little less Republican than the Republican. You never win on that message. But a bunch of people made a fortune in Washington on that. And they have this carpetbagging strategy. You know, so one of the reasons, so you know, what they'll do is, what pollsters do is this. Where is the public now? And then they tell candidates, run on that. And that's not what the Republicans do. You know, Republicans are willing to say things that are, I mean, okay, so Trump says things that are crazy, but Republicans are willing to say things that are unpopular. You know, in 1992, 65% of Americans believed that Roe v. Wade was absolutely right, and that women have the right to make that choice. And the Republicans ran against it, because they took a stand that was, I don't like their principles, but it was principle. And Democrats are afraid to do that. That means they do not know how to confront bullies. And that's one, I think that's probably the biggest problem. Just the other one is that they're wedded to a rationalist, to a kind of a rationalism that makes them irrational. That, you know, those of us who are, you know, we all vote based on our values, whether we're, you know, wherever we are on the spectrum. And values are a combination of beliefs with feelings tied strongly to them. And Republicans talk about those, and Democrats don't. Again, they talk about issues. You just lose that way. So if Democrats want to win, I mean, I think that message of "Make America Great Again" spoke so beautifully to what Americans feel, that we're falling in the world, that we're falling economically, that our family is falling, that my children are not going to do as well as I did. You know, that's what Americans were feeling, and he tapped right into it with that message. And there was just, Sanders had a message like it, but he wasn't going to get elected. So that was the problem.
So stop chasing polls, but move them.
Yeah, you've got to set the goalpost here when the poll is here. That's what Republicans do, and they win on doing that. But you may have answered the gentleman's question next to you, which is, if there is enough anxiety about Trump, I think we'll see a landslide the other way in 2018. And I do think there's a lot of people who, I mean, the playing fire with North Korea is scaring the hell out of a lot of us. And I think it scared the hell out of Bob Corker. I think it's why he said what he did, is that And I think your point is a great one about it only worked. I mean, Nixon was calculating, and Kissinger was calculating, but this guy isn't calculating anything.
So I worked on a project this summer that's going to come out later. I can't talk about it, but it's a documentary tentatively called The Korea Crisis. So what we did was we worked with a group of defectors from North Korea, including mental health professionals. And I don't know how much I can talk about. So, but what I wanted to say was they are indoctrinated over there that the United States wants to wipe them off the map. So they're shown propaganda films of mushroom clouds over the White House. They're shown all sorts of propaganda that our survival is dependent on us developing weapons to defend ourselves from the U.S. And what Trump is doing with what you call his madman strategy is he's fulfilling that for them. He is validating that for them. So it makes no sense. And when he makes, and I mentioned under the umbrella of sadism, but when he talks about, he may have to wipe North Korea off the map, he's talking about millions of North Korean civilians who are trapped under that regime he could care less about. So and I know it's not going to happen, and we make this point in the documentary, there needs to be a dialogue between the American people and North Korean people saying, this is not us, it's those two guys. Now, the other thing that you raised, that's interesting, is in clinical practice. Especially when you're doing CBT and you're trying to retrain, your client's thinking, and they have negative beliefs about the world. I mean, the first thing that comes out of their mouth now is, the world is a bad place. Trump is president. And where you go with that as a psychologist, it's a really tough place to be. Without having, you don't want to suggest you put your head in the sand and focus just on the four walls of your house, and don't think too far outside of that box. So you're right, it's a tough spot to be in.
So Seth, what I've done when I was in my clinical practice is, I love Columbo. That's an interesting idea. I just don't understand it. Would you tell me a little bit more? By the way, my wife said bring home a loaf of bread and 2 milk, or was it 2 loaves of bread? But tell me a little bit more about this. It's to get people off guard, and they get belligerent. I said, what's that green stuff coming out of your nose? If they're belligerent. But going one down is often much more effective than trying to meet it, especially at the intellectual level. It's not ideas, it's the emotion underneath. You're scared. Tell me a little bit more about that.
APA for psychologists hasn't, in writing, and I could be wrong, I don't want to say this with certainty, but I don't think their policy in writing, but they've come out publicly and strongly suggested not speaking up. The American Association of the American Psychoanalytic Association,
They just changed it.
came out in a letter and said, speak about it, it's that important.
I wish there was one of us old enough in the room to remember how people dealt with this in the 60s when they're the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, that was before your time, because that was such a long time ago. But I mean, there must have been exactly the same issue of existential kind of stuff.
My personal thinking is the 25th Amendment, our involvement in that does not stand a chance of succeeding. However, it is another iron in a fire. And that maybe that's where our strength comes from, is from another spoke in the wheel, from wherever it's going to come from. This is a pretty big statement, right, that Duty to Warn is doing right now. It's pretty big. It's national. It's a strong resistance. And so I think a little bit is good. Any little bit anybody can do and is willing to do. It just adds up. That's what I think.
I can just say one thing, and this is the Republicans, starting with Sarah Palin. 2 issues that we have is, first, they discredited intellectuals, educated people who know what they're talking about. Sarah Palin started that. And then Trump followed it up with fake news. So the two sources that are most qualified, be them um, scientists for the ecology, be it medical people, be it people like us, have already been discredited. And then the news that is basically the vehicle to get it out has also been discredited. And that's authoritarianism and fascism, and that's downright scary.
One safeguard against that, I totally agree with you. I think the war on real news is a scary development, especially, and his recent comments about that First Amendment and shutting that down. That is how fascism starts. And when you've got a strong enough group of people who are prone to fascist ideology, which is 40% of the population, starts out there. That is worrisome. The only thing I can say on the other side that's helpful to us is, if you think what happened with climate change, the right dominated that for so long until the weather changed. And now that the weather changed, the average American believes that this is caused by humans. And they're going to have trouble on that side. They're not going to pass any anti-environmental legislation. Because they're going to get pushback from their constituents on it. If the Democrats are smart enough to say, you just had your home blown away or burned down, for God's sakes, are you going to vote for this person who says that they're for more of it? I mean, do you want worse tornadoes? Because that's what you're going to get with this guy. I do think, in one sense, come back to your question, that fear, that existential fear that people are dealing with, is probably the strongest thing we have on our side. Because it is scaring people, and it's scaring Republicans, which is what needed to happen.
But the caveat is, never underestimate the power of denial, because we can deny all kinds of things. I'm not hurting. What makes you think I'm not anxious either?
Right.
And we can seduce ourselves with denial. So I'm going to have to be a little bit more clever. But your final word, confront. That's what we have to do. Taking the knowledge that we do have that is dependable and say, hey, have you heard? I want to talk to you about something important to me. I don't want to talk about politics. Well, that's too bad. Maybe later. But we have to make opportunities and not just wait until opportunities arise.
Now, you mentioned Rachel Maddow. You mentioned Rachel Maddow. So the people that I put on my slide, specifically Rick Wilson, David Jolly, Adam Schiff, they're all on Chris Hayes, Rachel Maddow, and Lawrence O'Donnell. So we reached out to all three of them. And Adam Schiff had no idea of what the movement was all about. So we sent him all kinds of materials. So getting the lawmakers involved, even if they're Democrats who are a bit handcuffed and can't do as much as if they were GOP, but some of the GOP hardliners are starting to come around. Right, so if you get it to a platform like that, like the MSNBC must-see TV hour between Chris Hayes and Lawrence O'Donnell, I mean, that can certainly spur a movement.